I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not a hero. I've never been a hero. I grew up in a two-bedroom apartment in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where the most dramatic thing that happened most weeks was my dad burning the grits on Sunday morning and my mom pretending she didn't notice. I joined the Galactic Medical Cooperative because the recruiter told me the pay was decent and the galaxy, quote, needed people who could keep calm under pressure. She forgot to mention that pressure in this context meant something entirely different from anything I'd known on Earth. I want to be clear about something else, too. What happened in Bay 7 of Mirova 9 Intake Ward on cycle 1189.44 wasn't dramatic in the way that people have started calling it. It wasn't a firefight. Nobody threw a punch, there were no explosions, nothing blew up. It was just me, a dying alien, and two words. Two stupid, simple human words that I didn't even think about saying. And yet here I am, 3 standard months later, sitting in a debriefing room with a recording device on the table, and a cooperative liaison staring at me like I did something remarkable. I didn't do something remarkable. I just did the only thing I knew how to do. But they asked me to write it down, so I'm writing it down. Section 2, Setup. Let me tell you about Mirova 9 first, because you need to understand the place to understand what happened there. Mirova 9 is not a nice station. It's not one of the gleaming hub stations you see in the recruitment brochures, the ones with the wide observation decks and the bioluminescent gardens and the restaurants that serve food from 40 different worlds. It's not the kind of place anyone is excited to arrive at. It's a waypoint station, which means it exists for exactly one reason: to handle the overflow from everywhere else. The station sits at the edge of the outer reach, which is a polite way of saying it sits at the edge of the part of the galaxy that the major powers largely pretend doesn't exist. The cooperative built it 17 standard years ago, when the refugee crisis in the Veth Expanse started generating more displaced persons than the main humanitarian stations could process. They built it fast, which means they built it cheap, and it shows. The walls sweat. That's the first thing I noticed when I was assigned there. The environmental systems were never properly calibrated for the variety of atmospheric conditions that different species require, so there's always this low-grade condensation on the inner hull plating. The corridors are always slightly damp. The lights are always slightly dim. The whole station smells like recycled oxygen and something organic that nobody has ever been able to identify and nobody really wants to. The intake ward, Bay 7 specifically, was where they put the cases that didn't fit anywhere else. Not the worst cases medically, necessarily. Mirova 9 had proper surgical facilities for those. Bay 7 was for the patients who presented with conditions that the existing diagnostic frameworks couldn't cleanly categorize. The ones who came in with symptoms that didn't match any known profile, or who belonged to species that the cooperative's medical database had limited information on, or who had been in transit so long that their baseline physiological data was essentially useless. The staff called it the puzzle ward. I called it the room where everyone is scared, because that was the more accurate description. I'd been posted to Bay 7 for about 4 months when this happened. 4 months of working 12 standard-hour shifts with a team of 3 other humans, 2 Varan clinicians, a Drossek nursing specialist, and a rotating cast of whatever volunteers the station coordinator could spare. 4 months of treating patients who didn't know what was wrong with them, in conditions that made diagnosis almost impossible, using equipment that was perpetually 3 generations behind the frontier standard. It was hard work. I'm not going to romanticize it. But I want to say this clearly. There was something important happening in Bay 7, something that I didn't fully appreciate until the night of cycle 1189.44, and something I've been thinking about almost every day since. We were doing something that the rest of the Galactic Medical Cooperative, for all its resources and sophistication, had not quite figured out how to do. We were sitting with people in the dark. Not metaphorically, literally sometimes. The power fluctuations on Mirova 9 were constant, and Bay 7 got the lowest priority on the restoration queue, so there were nights when we'd lose primary lighting for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch and just work by emergency biolume and whatever portable units we could scrape together. And in those hours, when everything got quieter and slower and more stripped down, I think we all got a little more honest about what we were actually doing. We weren't currying anyone in Bay 7, not usually. We were keeping them company while they waited to find out what was wrong with them. And that, it turned out, was its own kind of work. The patient who changed everything arrived on a transport called the Karev Solin, which was a Drosek freight hauler that had been pressed into humanitarian service about 2 years prior and was now technically registered as a medical support vessel, though it still smelled strongly of whatever cargo it had spent the first decade of its operational life carrying. The manifest said the patient was a Thurvak male, adult, approximate age 40 standard years, found unresponsive in the cargo hold of a smaller vessel that had been retrieved by the Karev Solin after putting out a distress signal in the outer reach. The smaller vessel had suffered some kind of drive failure and had been drifting for an estimated 19 days before recovery. The patient had been the only living occupant. There had been 3 other occupants. The manifest was careful about its language on this point. It said non-surviving crew members. The medic aboard the Karev Solin had written a note that said the cargo hold had been, quote, difficult to process emotionally. She hadn't elaborated. She didn't need to. The patient's name was listed as Yuvith Sarakdal, though the manifest noted that this information had been obtained from documents found in the vessel rather than from the patient himself, who had been non-communicative since recovery. He arrived in Bay 7 at the beginning of my overnight shift. I remember it was a quiet night, which was unusual. We'd had a run of high-volume intake over the previous week. A transport carrying Varen's seasonal workers had come in with an outbreak of something respiratory that had burned through the group fast, and we'd been slammed. But that had cleared. Most of those patients had been transferred to the main medical wing, and Bay 7 was down to 11 occupied beds out of its 24 capacity. 11 patients, each with their own puzzle, each with their own silence. Yuvith Sarakdal came in on a transfer bed, still in the clothes he'd apparently been wearing for 19 days. The transport crew had done their best with him. He was clean, rehydrated. His vitals were stable, but the look on the face of the Varen orderly who brought him in told me everything I needed to know about how this patient had been received on the Karev Solin. Fear, plain, uncomplicated fear. And I understood it, because Thurvak are frightening to look at if you've never seen one up close. Let me tell you about the Thurvak, because most of the documentation in the cooperative's database is clinical and cold, and doesn't actually convey what it feels like to be in the same room as one. They are large, that's the first thing. Not large in the way that Drosek are large. Drosek are big, but they're built along familiar lines, bipedal and proportionate in a way that your brain can categorize quickly. Thurvak are large in a way that takes your brain a moment to process, because the scale is just slightly wrong in every dimension. Yuvith at his most reduced, and he was clearly reduced. He was clearly a diminished version of whatever he normally was, still took up more physical space than any being I'd encountered in Bay 7 to that point. He was roughly bipedal, though his knees bent in the opposite direction from what I was used to, and his stance was wide, weight distributed across 4 limb points rather than 2. His skin, if you could call it that, was a deep, dark slate gray, somewhere between stone and storm cloud, and it had a texture that wasn't quite smooth and wasn't quite scaled, but was something in between. His head was broad, flat on the top, with a pronounced ridge that ran from the front of his skull to the back, and his eyes were set wide and deep, 2 discs of amber yellow that reflected light in a way that made them look lit from within. His hands, four-fingered, very long, were folded in his lap. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling. He had been looking at the ceiling since they brought him in, and in the 47 hours he'd been in Bay 7 before I encountered him, I was told he had not meaningfully changed this. He was not unconscious. His brain activity was normal for a Thurvac, which I had to look up, because our database on Thurvac neurology was thin. He was not in pain, as far as the sensors could determine. He was not responding to verbal communication, either in Galactic Standard or in the 3 Thurvac dialect variants that our translation unit could manage. He was not eating. He was not drinking. He was not sleeping, as far as anyone could tell. He was just lying there, looking at the ceiling, in what every member of the Bay 7 staff had quietly agreed was the most heartbreaking display of withdrawal they had ever witnessed. Dr. Venus Orith, our senior Varan clinician, had written in her notes that she believed the patient was experiencing a state of acute, grief-induced psychological dissociation. She noted that the Thurvac as a species were known to be deeply social, operating in tight family units called Sarac groups, which, and I only learned this later, was also part of Yuvith's name, Sarac Dal. The second part of his name was the designation for his family unit. He had been drifting in space for 19 days with the remains of his family. And now he was alone, in a room full of beings he didn't know, who were afraid of how he looked, who couldn't get through to him in any language, who kept hovering at the edge of his field of vision and taking readings and then retreating. Dr. Orith's notes concluded with a line that I read 3 times before I moved on. Patient appears to have made a decision about whether to continue. I want to talk about the moment I walked into Bay 7 that night, because I've been asked about it a lot, and I always feel like I'm not explaining it right. People want me to say I had a plan. They want me to say I looked at this patient, assessed the situation, and implemented a deliberate strategy based on training and protocol. That is not what happened. What happened is that I walked into Bay 7 at the start of my shift, did my initial round of the ward, got to bed 14, the one in the far back corner, the one that was furthest from the nurse's station and the bustle of the ward entrance, and found Yuvith Sarakdal lying exactly as the outgoing shift had described, which is to say absolutely still, eyes open, looking at nothing. And I just stood there for a minute. My training told me what to do. Check his chart, confirm his vitals are reading correctly, note his presentation for continuity of care, move on to the next patient. There were 10 other people in that ward who needed attention. But I stood there because he was just so completely alone. I don't know how else to describe it. There's a particular kind of aloneness that has a physical quality to it, that you can almost feel radiating off a person, and Yuvith had it in a way I had never encountered before or since. It was like standing next to a building in winter, this cold, empty emanation that had nothing to do with temperature. I pulled up the chair that was next to his bed, the chair that was there for family members or support persons, the chair that had probably been sitting empty since Yuvith arrived. I sat down in it. I pulled up his chart on my handheld unit. I read through it. The usual things: vitals, intake records, Dr. Orith's notes, the notes from the previous 2 shifts. I read all of it. Then I set the handheld unit down on my knee and just looked at him for a while. He was still looking at the ceiling. The ward was quiet. 2 of the other patients were asleep. One, an elderly Varan woman in bed 9, was making the low humming sound that Varans made when they were in light sleep. It was soothing actually, once you got used to it. The environmental systems were cycling through their regular rhythm. The lights were at their overnight setting, which on Mirova 9 meant slightly dimmer than dim. I said his name, Yuvith. Nothing. I tried the Galactic Standard greeting, nothing. I tried the Thurvac greeting phrase that the translation unit had given me, which I will not try to render phonetically here because I am not qualified to do that, but which the unit told me meant something close to "I see you, and I am not a threat." His eyes moved. Not toward me, not toward anything specific, just moved, shifted slightly like a small internal adjustment. But it was the first movement anyone had recorded in 47 hours. I sat very still. Section 3. Build tension. Let me be honest about what I was thinking in those first 10, 15 minutes. I was thinking that I was probably wasting time. I was thinking that Dr. Orith had been working on this patient for almost 2 days and had gotten nowhere, and Dr. Orith was a board-certified specialist with 30 years of experience in multi-species critical care. I was Corpsman 3rd Class Devin Calloway, 26 years old, 2 years out of the GMC training program, whose most significant prior medical achievement was successfully managing an outbreak of Varron skin irritation on a transport hauler without anyone going into anaphylaxis. I was thinking, what exactly do you think you're going to accomplish here, Devin? But I also couldn't make myself leave. There's something that happens when you sit with a person who is in that kind of pain, something that happens to your own nervous system. You get very quiet. Your breathing slows down. Your brain stops running its usual background chatter and just focuses. I don't know if that's training or if it's something more fundamental, something built into the way humans are wired to respond to suffering in others. But it happened every time in that ward, and it was happening now. I sat with him. I talked a little, not about anything in particular. I'd learned in 4 months of Base 7 that sometimes the content of what you said mattered less than the sound of it, the rhythm and the tone. I talked about my shift, about the previous week's respiratory outbreak, about the Varron woman in bed 9 whose name was something I couldn't pronounce, but who had been teaching me to play a Varron strategy game during her more alert periods. I talked about the station, about how the lights in Corridor 7 had been flickering for 3 weeks and maintenance kept saying they'd get to it. Small things, real things. Yuvith's eyes were still on the ceiling. But something had changed in his breathing. I was watching his chest, or the equivalent of his chest. Thurvac respiratory anatomy is a bit different, and the rhythm had altered slightly. Not better or worse, just different, like something had shifted internally. I kept talking. At some point in the second hour of my shift, one of the other patients called out, a Drossek male in bed 6 who'd been having intermittent anxiety responses as a side effect of his medication, and I had to go deal with that. It took about 20 minutes, talk him through the breathing exercise, check his levels, adjust the environmental settings around his bed, sit with him until he settled. Then I did a pass of the other patients, checked readings, documented what needed documenting. Then I went back to bed 14. I don't know why, I just did. I sat back down in the chair. Yuvith hadn't moved, but his breathing had shifted again. I noticed it immediately. It was faster now, and there was a quality to it that I recognized from the charts, from Dr. Orith's notes. Elevated respiration in Thurvac was one of the physiological markers of acute distress. I leaned forward slightly in the chair. Hey, I said, not in galactic standard, not in any language I'd been trained to use, just hey. Like I was talking to anyone, like I was talking to someone I knew. His eyes moved, and this time they moved toward me. It was a small movement, maybe 5 degrees, maybe less, but those amber-yellow eyes, those deep, lit-from-within eyes shifted away from the ceiling and toward the source of the sound, which was me. I went very still. He was looking at me. Not at the ceiling, not at nothing, at me. I don't know what he saw. I've thought about this a lot, and I genuinely don't know what a human must look like to a Thurvac, what register of creature we fall into in their perceptual world. But he was looking at me, and for the first time in 47 hours, there was something in those eyes besides absence. I'm not going to dress it up and call it hope. It wasn't hope. It was something earlier than hope, something more basic, something like recognition that there is a world outside this moment. I held very still. He was looking at me. And then slowly, with the heaviness of something moving through water, he tried to move his arm. This is the part of the story that people always want me to dramatize, and I'm going to resist that, because the drama of it was in its quietness, not in anything explosive or sudden. He tried to move his arm. It was his right arm, or what I was thinking of as his right arm, the one closest to me. The long fingers unfolded slightly, not reaching, not gesturing, just opening, like a question. His respiration was elevated. His vital monitors, which had been so consistently flat they'd become like background noise, were now showing the subtle variances of active neural engagement. He was present. He was here, in a way he hadn't been. And he was distressed. Whatever had pulled him back from wherever he'd retreated to, it had pulled him back into the pain, into full awareness of where he was and why he was there and what had happened to him. And that awareness was, in that moment, clearly unbearable. His arm moved again, that same incomplete gesture, not reaching, not asking for anything specific, just movement, just some animal expression of I am in here and I don't know how to do this. I looked at his arm. I looked at my own hands. I knew the protocols. Physical contact between medical personnel and patients of unfamiliar species was specifically addressed in the cooperative's code of practice. Exercise caution, await consent signals, defer to established cultural norms where documentation exists. The documentation on Thurvac physical contact norms was, as I have mentioned, thin. I made a call. I made it without overthinking it, which might have been reckless, and I've thought about whether it was reckless many times since. But in that moment, with that particular patient, in that particular silence, it felt less like a decision and more like the only possible thing. I reached out and I put my hand on his forearm. Not grabbing, not restraining, just there, palm down, light. He went completely still. And I mean completely. Every muscle. The breathing stopped for a moment. I counted 1, 2, 3, and then it came back, slower than before. I kept my hand where it was. I didn't say anything. The ward was quiet. The Varan woman in bed 9 was still humming. The lights were still at their overnight dimness. The environmental systems were still cycling. 20 seconds, 30. Yuvith Sarakdal, who had spent 47 hours looking at nothing, who had been making the decision that Dr. Orith had noted with such clinical restraint, who had watched his family die in the dark of a broken ship over 19 days of drifting silence, let out a breath. A long, slow exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his lungs. And then he made a sound. I had to listen to the recording 3 times later to understand what the translation unit made of it. The sound itself was low and resonant, produced somewhere in the chest cavity, and it had a quality that I don't have good words for. It wasn't a word exactly. It was more like a frequency, like the Thurvac equivalent of a sound that precedes words, that exists in the space before language. The translation unit flagged it as a query, a basic, elemental query below the level of sentence structure. The closest rendering in galactic standard, the unit said, was something like, "What are you?" And by "what are you," it meant something different from the taxonomic question. Not what species are you, not what rank or role do you occupy, something more foundational. What kind of thing are you? Because I had done something, sitting there, talking to him, coming back to sit again, putting my hand on his arm, that didn't fit a pattern he had a category for. He'd been on a station for 47 hours surrounded by beings who were afraid of him, who approached him in pairs for safety, who took their readings and retreated. And then this small, soft-looking creature had pulled up a chair and just stayed. He was asking what I was. and I didn't have an answer that the translation unit could render into Thurvak, so I said the only thing I had. Section 4, Climax. Easy buddy. 2 words. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that gets described in ways that make me uncomfortable. People hear the phrase and they imagine something authoritative, something confident, some display of human steadiness in the face of alien turmoil. That's not what it was. Easy buddy is what I said when I had nothing else, when my training had given me all it had to give, and what was left was just me, Devin Calloway, 26 years old, whose dad used to say those exact words every time the family dog got scared during thunderstorms, whose older brother used to say them to him, Devin, during bad nights in the apartment when the walls felt too close and the city outside was too loud and sleep felt impossible. Easy buddy. Not a medical term, not a protocol, not even a complete thought. Just the thing that humans say to each other, and to dogs, and to younger brothers, and apparently on the right night, to dying aliens in Waypoint Station wards, when they want to communicate one single thing. I'm here, I see you. It's going to be okay to still be here. Yuvith went quiet for a moment after I said it. The translation unit, I found out later, had rendered it into something in the Thurvak dialect, had found the closest available equivalent, some combination of sounds that carried something like steady, companion. Not perfect. Translations never are, but close enough. He turned his head. All the way. For the first time since he'd arrived at Mirova 9, Yuvith Sarakdal turned his head and looked directly at another living being. At me. Those amber-yellow eyes, lit from within, found my face and stayed there. His hand, the one I'd touched, the one that had opened slightly with that incomplete gesture, moved again. And this time it was not incomplete. This time the long fingers reached across the few inches between us and settled, very lightly, on top of my hand. His hand was much larger than mine. The fingers spread past my wrist. The weight of it was considerable. Thurvak musculature is dense. The weight-to-size ratio is higher than most humanoid species. But the touch was careful, deliberate in its carefulness. He was a being who understood somehow, in whatever part of his awareness was still functioning clearly, that he could hurt me without meaning to. He didn't hurt me. He just held my hand. And then the thing happened that made Dr. Orith cry when I described it to her the next morning, and made the station coordinator sit down heavily in his chair, and made the senior staff request a full debrief, and eventually made its way into an official report that ended up on tables I would never sit at. Yuvith Sarakdal made a sound. Not the elemental query sound from before, a different sound. Still low, still resonant, still produced somewhere deep in the chest cavity, but structured, patterned. The translation unit processed it for 11 seconds, which is a long time for modern translation software, before rendering a result. The result read, "I did not think there would be another." And then, after a pause, "I did not think anything would hold." I sat there with him. I don't know how long, an hour maybe more. My duties in the ward required me to move periodically, other patients, other readings, other moments of small attention, but I kept coming back to bed 14. And each time I came back and sat down, Yuvith was watching for me, not at the ceiling, at the ward entrance, waiting. He began to talk. Not continuously, not in long sentences, in the halting, broken way of someone who has been inside silence for so long that language has become difficult again. The translation unit struggled with some of it. His Thurvak dialect had regional variations that didn't match the samples in the database well, but it caught enough. He told me about his family, about his Sarak, his 3 companions, the beings whose names were part of his own. He told me they had been traveling for work, some kind of contract in the outer reach, the specific nature of which I didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. He told me the drive failure had been catastrophic and fast. He told me that the 19 days of drifting had been, And here the translation unit gave me a phrase that I have kept because I think it's the most precise thing I've ever seen rendered in galactic standard. A long lesson in what it costs to be the one who stays. The one who stays. I've thought about those words for 3 months. He told me about each of them, about the way they had been organized as a unit, the roles they'd held, the specific textures of each relationship. There was a level of detail in how he described each person that made it clear this was not the casual description of friends or colleagues. In Thurvak-Sarak culture, which I have since read extensively about, the unit is the fundamental unit of personhood. You are not quite fully yourself outside of it. The names reflect this. Sarak Dal was not just Yuvith's family name. It was part of his identity in a way that has no clean translation in any human language I know of. He had lost 3 pieces of his personhood, and the remaining piece had been lying in a waypoint station bed, in a ward full of strangers, trying to decide if it was possible to continue being a person when so much of what made you one was gone. I listened. I kept my hand where it was, where he'd placed it, warm under his fingers. I said almost nothing, just the things you say when someone is telling you something true and terrible. Yes, and I hear you. And once, when he said something that the translation unit rendered as it would have been cleaner to go with them, I said, very quietly, "I'm glad you didn't." He looked at me for a long time after that. Then he said, "You are a strange creature." And I said, "Yeah. We get that a lot." And he made a sound that the translation unit flagged as uncertain, possible humor response, confidence 67%, which was the closest thing to a laugh that had been recorded in his medical file. Somewhere around the 4th hour of my shift, I left him for about 40 minutes to deal with a situation in the other side of the ward. The Drosek patient's anxiety had escalated, and I needed the secondary clinician's help, and it took longer than it should have. When I came back, I half expected to find Yuvith returned to his ceiling staring, the connection broken, whatever fragile thread we'd been maintaining snapped. He was sitting up. It was the first time since his arrival that he had altered his position. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, knees bent in their reverse configuration, hands on his thighs, watching the ward entrance. When I came through, he made a short sound. The translation unit said, "You came back." Not a question, an observation, like he was filing it away. "Yeah," I said, "I came back." I sat down. Not in the chair this time. The chair was too far from where he was sitting, and that felt wrong. I sat on the edge of the bed, a few feet from him, which was probably also not protocol and which I was not particularly focused on. "Are you hungry?" I asked. The translation unit processed this. Yuvith considered it. "I do not know," he said. "That's fine," I said. "I'm going to get you something anyway, small. You don't have to eat it." He looked at me. "Why would you bring something I do not have to eat?" "Because you might want to," I said. "And if you don't, that's fine too, but having the option is different from not having it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the translation unit rendered as, "This is the way you think." "Something like that," I said. I got him something from the ward nutrition station, something bland, something that the Thurvak dietary notes in the database suggested was low risk for his species. I set it on the tray next to his bed. I didn't make a thing of it. I didn't watch him to see if he ate. He ate some of it. Not all, but some. Section 5, Resolution. By the time Dr. Orith arrived for her morning shift, Yuvith Sarak Dal had been sitting up for 4 hours. He had eaten approximately a third of the food I'd provided. He had drunk 2 standard units of the hydration solution that the nutrition system had flagged as compatible with his biology. His vital signs, all of them, not just the ones that had been in the safe zone all along, were showing normal Thurvak parameters for the first time since his arrival. Dr. Orith stood at the ward entrance for a moment before she came in. I was at the nurse's station, finishing my shift notes, and I saw her face when she looked toward bed 14. She looked at Yuvith, who was sitting up, who was looking around the ward with those amber-yellow eyes, not at the ceiling, not at nothing, but at the actual world of Bay 7, at the other patients, at the equipment, at the ordinary, unremarkable busyness of a medical ward beginning its morning. Then she looked at me. I shrugged. I didn't really have an explanation that would fit in the amount of time I had before I needed to go home and sleep. "What did you do?" she asked. "I sat with him," I said. She looked like she wanted more than that. "I talked to him," I said, "and I put my hand on his arm, and I said, 'Easy, buddy,' when he got scared." Dr. Orith is one of the most composed beings I have ever met. 30 years in multi-species critical care will do that to you. She has seen things that I cannot imagine, and she processes them with a professional calm that I have always genuinely admired. She pressed her hands against her eyes for about 3 seconds. Then she straightened up, smoothed her uniform, and walked toward bed 14 with the purposeful stride of someone who had work to do. I watched her for a moment. She stopped at the foot of Yuvith's bed. He looked at her. She said something in the Thurvak greeting phrase, the one that meant "I see you and I am not a threat." Her pronunciation was better than mine. Yuvith made a short sound. The translation unit, I still had mine active, said, "You brought the one who stays." Dr. Orith looked back at me. I picked up my bag and went home. I slept for 10 hours. When I came back for my next shift, bed 14 had been moved. Not because anything was wrong, because Yuvith, in the hours since morning rounds, had begun to be more physically active, and the bed in the back corner wasn't suitable for the kind of assisted movement protocols that Dr. Orith now had him on. They'd moved him to bed 3, which was bigger, near the window panel that showed the exterior of the station, the cold stars of the outer reach, the distant smear of nebula that you could see from the portside windows on clear system days. He was standing when I came in, standing with the support of a mobility assist on one side looking at the window. He heard me come in. His auditory range is broader than ours. I'd learned and turned. "You slept," he said. The translation unit rendered this as a statement with the tonal quality of mild accusation. "I did," I said. "It's generally recommended." "How long?" 10 hours. He considered this. "That is a long time to be unconscious." "Humans need it," I said. "We don't work as well without it." "You worked well enough." I pulled up the chair. The new bed had a different chair next to it. This one was more comfortable, actually, which I suspected was not an accident. "How are you feeling?" He was quiet for a moment, looking back at the window. "I am feeling," he said finally. And I understood that this was the answer. Not "I am feeling well" or "I am feeling better," just "I am feeling," as opposed to the alternative. As opposed to the decision that had been hovering over bed 14 for 47 hours. "Yeah," I said, "that sounds about right." Over the next 11 days, the remainder of my rotation before my leave cycle, I spent part of every shift with Yuvith. It wasn't officially assigned. Dr. Orith had noted in his care plan that human-led interaction sessions had produced marked improvement in patient engagement and neurological baseline recovery, and she'd requested that the staffing coordinator ensure a human team member was always on shift when Yuvith was active, but she hadn't specifically assigned me. I just kept showing up. We talked a lot eventually. His galactic standard improved faster than I expected. Thurvak language acquisition, I learned, is accelerated when they are in a state of high engagement, which made me realize that the 47 hours of silence had been not just grief, but withdrawal from engagement itself, from the fundamental desire to understand and be understood. He told me about his culture, about Sarak's structure and what it means, at a deeper level than I'd read in the database. He told me that the name Sarak Dal would remain with him, that in Thurvak tradition you don't shed the names of the dead, that they stay with you as part of who you are. They are not gone from me, he said once, and the translation unit rendered it with a note that the phrase had a grammatical tense structure that implied ongoing presence rather than memory. They are still in here. He touched his chest. Just not outside. I told him about my family, about Chattanooga and the two-bedroom apartment and my dad's grits and my brother's habit of saying easy, buddy, every time something got difficult. I told him about how I'd ended up in the GMC, about the 4 months in Bay 7, about what it was like to work in a place where the best you could usually offer was company. He listened to all of this with a quality of attention that I've never experienced from another being. Thurvak, I came to understand, listen with their whole bodies. Not as a performance, just naturally. You feel when a Thurvak is listening to you like every word is being received completely, like nothing is falling through. It was, strangely, one of the more meaningful experiences of my life. On the 8th day, he asked me a question that I've been thinking about ever since. We were sitting together in the morning light, the slow blue light that the station's exterior panels took on in the early hours, which I'd always liked, and Yuvith had been quiet for a while, which I'd learned to be comfortable with. His silences were different from the first 47 hours. They weren't absence. They were thought. He said, "Why do humans do this?" Do what? Stay. He considered his words. He was careful with galactic standard in a way that came from genuine respect for precision. I was not your concern. I was not your Sarak. I was not any category of being that required your particular attention, and yet you stayed. I thought about it for a minute. I wanted to give him a real answer. I don't know if I can explain it completely, I said. But I think, for most humans, the thing that matters isn't the category. It's just whether someone needs company. If someone needs company, you stay. He looked at me. That is not universal among the species you have encountered. No, I said, it's not. Why is it for humans? I thought about the apartment in Chattanooga. About thunderstorms and scared dogs and a brother who said easy, buddy with total sincerity. About my dad, who burned the grits every Sunday and whose greatest gift to me was that he always sat down at the table anyway, because the sitting down was the point. I think, I said slowly, because we've been scared for a really long time for all of our history. We've been the small thing in the dark, and the only thing that ever helped was finding another small thing in the dark and staying close to them. I think it got built in. I think it's just in us now. Yuvith was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Then your fear made you kind." And I didn't have anything to say to that, so I didn't say anything. But I sat there with him for a while longer. Section 6, the ending. On the 11th day, the transport was arranged. Yuvith was medically cleared. Dr. Orith had done exceptional work in those 11 days, getting him to a point of physical stability that she described in her notes as exceeding initial prognosis significantly. He was going to a full facility, a real one, not a waypoint station, a Thurvak-designated rehabilitation center in the mid-reach that had experience with trauma recovery for Sarak-bereaved individuals. It wasn't a short journey, but it was the right place. I was on shift when they came to transfer him. He had packed, though packed is the wrong word since he'd arrived with nothing. What he had was a small collection of things that various ward staff had given him over the days, small tokens, the kind of things people leave for patients they've grown fond of. A smooth stone from someone's collection, a folded paper in some origami shape that one of the other patients had made, a recording chip with music on it, traditional Thurvak music that Dr. Orith had tracked down from the cultural archive. He stood in the center of Bay 7, beside bed 3, and looked around the ward for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said something in Thurvak, not in galactic standard. The translation unit processed it, and gave me a phrase that I've written down in 3 different places, so I won't forget it. You were the proof that the world was still there. I needed proof before I could go back to it. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been proportionate. Then he did something that the cooperative's cultural database on Thurvac had, I later found out, no record of. He lowered himself not fully to his knees, but into what I can only describe as a partial bow, a lowering of the enormous, broad-ridged head, the long body folding with unexpected grace. And then he straightened, and he placed one hand briefly on top of my head. Light, careful, the same deliberate carefulness that had been in every touch since the beginning. Then he walked to the transfer team, folded himself into the corridor, and was gone. Dr. Orith filed her report 3 days later. The station coordinator filed a supplementary report the week after. Both reports made their way to the cooperative's Human Liaison Division, which is the body tasked with tracking patterns in human-alien medical interactions, specifically looking for data that might inform training and protocol updates. I was asked to give testimony. I have given this testimony. In the 6 weeks since the incident, I have received 17 messages from various offices within the cooperative, most of them from researchers and clinicians who wanted to discuss what they were calling the Sarac-Dahl interaction. 2 of them have used the phrase paradigm shifting. One of them, a very senior Varan researcher in multispecies psychology, sent me a 40-page paper and asked if I would review it for accuracy. I read the paper. It was very good. It used a lot of terminology I didn't fully understand, but at the core of it was something simple that I recognized. It said that the thing I had done in Bay 7 was not extraordinary from a clinical standpoint. It was not a new technique. It was not a breakthrough in cross-species medical communication. It was, in fact, one of the oldest and most elemental things that a medical professional can do, something so foundational that it often gets lost in the sophistication of modern galactic healthcare. It said that I had been present, that I had stayed when staying was not required, and had communicated that staying with the language of staying, which is the only language that actually conveys it. The paper argued that this was, in fact, a distinctly human behavior in its particular expression, though the underlying capacity existed in many species. It argued that humans, perhaps because of their evolutionary history, their particular combination of social complexity and physical vulnerability, had developed the practice of purposeful presence, of being with someone not in order to fix them or solve them or manage them, but simply to be another consciousness in the same space, to refuse to let the space be empty, to a degree, and with a consistency that was, in the current data, unusual among the known sapient species. The paper's conclusion was that the cooperative should think carefully about how it trained and deployed its human medical personnel, and specifically about the value of what it called the human instinct to remain. I read this conclusion 3 times. Then I thought about my brother, sitting on the edge of my bed on bad nights, saying easy, buddy, with total sincerity, not because he had a strategy or a training program or a protocol, but because he was there and I was scared and staying was the only thing he knew to do. I wrote the researcher back and told her the paper was accurate. I didn't tell her about the grits. That felt like it was for me. I was asked, in the formal debrief, whether I thought what had happened with Yuvith Sarac-Dahl had changed me. I said I thought it had clarified something I already knew. The debriefer asked me to elaborate. I said, I came to Bay 7 because I thought I was here to fix people, to diagnose them, treat them, solve the puzzle of what was wrong with them and address it. And sometimes that's what the work is. Sometimes you diagnose and you treat and you move on. But sometimes the puzzle isn't medical. Sometimes the thing that's wrong is that someone is completely alone in a room full of people who are afraid of them, and the fix, if there is one, isn't in the database. It's just you and the chair and the willingness to stay in it. The debriefer wrote this down. They asked if I had anything else to add for the record. I said, tell whoever reads this, tell them it's not complicated. It's actually the least complicated thing. You just have to be willing to sit in an uncomfortable room with someone who is hurting and say easy, buddy, and mean it, and come back. That's it. That's the whole thing. I got a message from the Thurvak Rehabilitation Center 4 weeks after Yuvith's transfer. It was brief. The center's human liaison wrote it on his behalf, since his galactic standard was still developing, and the center didn't have translation units as sophisticated as ours. It said, "The patient Yuvith Sarakdal has asked me to convey to Korsman Calloway that he is continuing. He asks me to tell you that this is because he was given proof. He says you will understand what this means. He also asks me to tell you, easy buddy." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to work. Bay 7 was full that day. A new transport had come in overnight, 7 patients, 3 species I'd never worked with before, 2 charts that made no sense to me at all. The familiar puzzle, the familiar quiet. The Varan woman in bed 9, she was back. A follow-up admission, same bed, same slow hum during her light sleep periods. I started my rounds. At bed 17, a young Drosek patient, first admission, sat rigid with fear in the middle of a ward full of things she'd never seen. She hadn't spoken since arrival. Her chart said she'd been non-communicative for 16 hours. I checked her chart. I checked her vitals. I checked all the things I was supposed to check. Then I pulled up the chair. Sat down. "Hey," I said. She looked at me. "Easy," I said. "I'm not going anywhere."